Welcome to this session. It falls to me to have the privilege of chairing the session. My name's David Evans. I am Lord Evans of Sealand, learning to be a parliamentarian in the House of Lords, formerly General Secretary of the Labour Party up until the end of last year's conference, so I am basking this year in it not being my fault. So it's a real pleasure to be at this important fringe. We are hosted by Freedom of Expression charity Index on Censorship, and this event is in partnership with SME for Labour, an organisation that represents small and medium-sized businesses at all levels of political decision-making. Today we're going to discuss how smart digital regulation can firstly strike a balance between securing our economy and growth, secondly safeguard freedom of speech, and thirdly support SMEs and the wider tech sector to innovate. We're going to answer the fundamental question, with threats to encryption on the horizon globally and calls to break end-to-end encryption in the UK, how can we protect fundamental human rights as well as the UK's world-class tech industry? Let me just very quickly introduce our eminent panel. We have James Ball, political editor of The New World, formerly the New European. James is one of the UK's leading investigative journalists, having worked on many laundering investigations, the Edward Snowden disclosures, winning a number of major journalism awards in the process. Jemimah Steinfeld is the Chief Executive of Index on Censorship, the campaigning freedom of expression organisation. Index on Censorship was founded in 1972 to publish dissident writers from the Soviet Union, and over the last 50 years has published some, if not all, of the world's leading dissident thinkers and writers. Before Index, Jemimah lived in Shanghai and Beijing, and has written extensively about youth culture, gender and censorship in contemporary China. Vinous is Deputy Executive Director at Startup Coalition, hopefully emblazoned on the sweatshirt. She formerly led Tech UK's domestic policy work after years working at the heart of Westminster in various political roles. Vinous has completed a fellowship on the future of work at Cambridge's Centre for Science and Policy as a fully fledged techno-optimist. We're also joined by Rokhsana Fiaz, OBE, the Mayor of Newham. Rox was elected Mayor of Newham in 2018, first woman directly elected Mayor of any London borough. Newham is home to many of the UK's leading tech companies around Stratford and the Excel Centre. Before she was Mayor of Newham, Rokhsana led many campaigns, including work on the Robin Hood tax to prevent global tax avoidance. My qualifications for chairing this panel are relatively scant compared to the panellists, but I'm here to stop. There'll be no biting and scratching. We'll come in on time. Our panellists will be excellent and succinct in their responses to enable us to take questions from the floor before we finish at 1:50. But such experience as I do have, as General Secretary of the Labour Party, I spent the first 18 months of my tenure embroiled in the consequences of dealing with the leaked report, which qualifies me, I think, to a degree in understanding the carnage that can be caused by tech leaks. I've also just joined the Navy. Well, I haven't joined the Navy. I'm participating in the Parliamentary Armed Forces scheme, where I'm attached to the Navy for a year. And down at Navy Command in Portsmouth last week, we were told that there are thousands of daily attacks, cyber attacks on the MOD and our defence systems, thousands of them. And another interesting fact that may or may not be germane to anything we're going to discuss, I learned that 95% of data isn't in the sky, it's under the sea. And so the threat of Russian disruption to undersea pipelines is real and present. But anyway, they're just two. And I also did run my own business, so I'm qualified in terms of SME on that score too. Right, over to the panel. I'll just take it in order from my left to right. I'd like to invite each of the panellists to introduce themselves for 2 minutes, and I will put the clock on you.
So I'm a journalist. I've worked with a lot of classified sources, a lot of whistleblowers around the world, sometimes in countries where getting caught could get you arrested, sometimes tortured, sometimes killed. I am not a normal user of the internet. And so for someone like me, this is whether messages are encrypted end-to-end, whether the internet is secure, is a matter of whether I can do my job and whether my sources can live. For most people, the debate feels very different. It is often framed as, are you on the side of big tech or are you on the side of children? You know, if you want safe children, or do you want Mark Zuckerberg to be richer? And I think this is a very dangerous framing, because the virtue of end-to-end encryption is it's secure by design. It actually takes power and information away from tech companies, and it means your data sits with you, sits with your devices. It means there aren't big caches of things they can access. It means there's no master key that a hacker can get hold of and get in. It means that you have privacy, but it means you have security. And one of the big issues with this debate is when we're rejecting populism, we ask why people say there are no trade-offs. You know, Nigel Farage claims you can kick out migrants and the economy won't suffer. People claim you can tax ultra-rich billionaires and we can fund every public service without raising anything. The NSPCC and some government agencies are saying there's no trade-off here. You can undermine encryption just for the good guys and the bad guys won't get in. You can't. It's not true when anyone says it. And there is a trade-off between security from hackers, security from those, and the kind of security that would be got by ending end-to-end encryption. And so I think we need to reframe the issue. I think it needs to be seen as being against big tech. And also, we are seeing Donald Trump chase his political opponents using everything from mortgage applications to statements from 5 or 10 years ago. The idea that normal citizens might need privacy from their government is not alien in America anymore. We have the chance of a populist government in the UK in the next 5 years, and its leader is petty and holds grudges. I know because I was banned from Reform's conference. So also, the paranoid niche use case of people like me might not be as paranoid as it used to be. So end-to-end encryption, good.
Thank you, James. Ross.
Thank you very much. I'm coming at this 3 levels. First, in my role as the Mayor of Newham and the Portfolio Lead for Inclusive Growth, I'm looking at the importance of data economy, new frontiers of growth as part of ensuring that our residents aren't left behind as we progress in the context of disruption happening and the future world of work and what that actually also means for businesses, and the importance of literacy and enhancing a understanding, competency and capability for all sections of society so that no one's left behind. I think there's also an important arena which I am very much engaged with in the context of local government being very challenged financially and being asked rightly to demonstrate that we're spending every single penny and pound wisely and optimally. So there's a language of transformation and service delivery and how that can be done in the context of using new tools, including data and everything that entails around personal data. And Newham had been one of the boroughs identified in the early stages of COVID-19 when we did the early trial of Test and Trace app. And the reason we were chosen was because we'd been identified by government as an early adopter borough because of the profile of our resident population. And then there's obviously the issues relating to people and issues of vulnerability, and evidently everyone's familiar with the arguments around keeping children safe, but it's also other vulnerable residents. A prime example, I've got an 84-year-old father. He's got early onset of old age memory loss frequently, but I've noticed of late that he is being targeted by other social media apps that he uses. And how do we ensure that we protect and safeguard? And in the context of all of that, what we're doing in Newham is threefold. One, being very transparent and open with our residents that we need to be engaged in this debate and actually what it is that you need to know to keep yourself safe, and enhancing data literacy, of which encryption and privacy issues are paramount, and also the wider London government sector in the capital. I'm the Data and Innovation Lead for London Council's work with Lottie, and these issues are very live as it relates to the use of very sensitive data from the public sector, which we want to be able to share as part of our transformation, including adult social care data and children's services data, and data as it relates to housing. But to the point that James made, we live in very perilous times, and I should add, I come from a security interest background. My policy specialism is prevent. It's how do you ensure protection of civil liberties in an age where you have a new iteration of Big Brother, post-truth environment, conspiracy theories running around and really undermining politics.
I think we will answer those questions. Thank you, Rob.
So I have much the same points as James. It's not hyperbolic for me to say that I can't do my job without encryption. I use it all the time. My workforce use encrypted apps to talk. We're a remote office, and we're a remote office, and that is how we basically have our chitter-chatter is via encrypted apps. I'm in about 6 different groups as well on Signal, connecting to Hong Kong and Chinese dissidents, connecting to Afghan journalists and women. I would lose all of that tomorrow if encryption, end-to-end encryption, was broken. The idea that you can just kind of partially open a back door and just look at some people's messages is rubbish. Once it's open for everyone, and it would make my sources and everyone that I work with much less safe, and would effectively mean that we could communicate far less. So obviously Index has always promoted freedom of expression. Privacy is essential to how we communicate, and that we all use our phones. That is a reality of 2025, how we communicate. So the idea that we want to suddenly go back to a place where we're kind of meeting in dark lit rooms to communicate in that way privately just doesn't work today. This is how we do communicate. And the final point, because I actually have 40 seconds left. I like this efficiency. The final point I would say, which has been also touched on, is that I chart freedom of expression violations around the world, and I am seeing how people's communications are used against them. And we have to be, what might seem completely harmless to us, say confiding in someone about our, new same-sex relationship or something, feels very, very different in the eyes of certain governments and certain authoritarians. And we also have the march of the authoritarians right now. So I think that we shouldn't just assume that everything that we post in our private conversations is harmless, and I think we should protect those conversations.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yes,
So I probably come at this from a slightly different perspective, particularly from James and Jemimah, in that sort of, where I sit, it's far more about sort of like your regular consumer of the internet, and of the expectations that consumers have about how their data is stored and used, etc. We've seen how recent breaches, whether it's sort of Jaguar Land Rover or M&S, sort of like undermine that general environment of sort of trust and confidence. And so whilst James and Jemimah are doing, you know, fantastic work in making sure that we can all live freer lives, I guess I come from the perspective of, and what does that look like on a day-to-day basis in terms of how we as consumers and citizens engage with business as well as the state. So the startup ecosystem in the UK is the most mature across Europe. We constantly rank number one amongst our European friends, and sit sort of third in the list in terms of sort of like the maturity of our ecosystem behind the US and China. Just in the first quarter of 2025 alone, UK startups raised over $7 billion in capital. And so when we are talking about a government that is keen to promote growth, really the sort of tech ecosystem and startups as part of that is like critical. And one thing that I would say with love about the ecosystem is that it is very vibes based. And so founders are, you know, it is one guy or girl on their laptop. And so they can do their work from wherever they choose. And so for them to choose London, they do have to, you know, have a sense of confidence that this government is stable, understands the issues that matter to them, etc. And I think, you know, the UK has done a fantastic job to date in positioning itself as a rules-based order that businesses and startups can navigate through, you know, in a way that is sort of both stable and reassuring. So, you know, positioning us slightly differently to both the US and the direction that they're headed in, but also China. And I think, you know, conversations that are starting to trickle through about undermining end-to-end encryption, etc., cause real concern amongst the sort of founder community. And I think when they are building sort of like the apps that we will all come to use and become sort of like household names, on the consumer end, encryption also really matters because we are trusting these companies, you know, in return for sort of convenience. And I'm not talking about big tech here. I'm talking about, you know, the upcoming fintechs and legal techs, etc. We're trusting these companies with our data, and that is a trust that they like, you know, hold very dearly and very closely to them. And so encryption for us and the community that I represent is not just about sort of the interaction between the state and the citizen, but also between consumers and the companies that they choose to use.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the first question. I've got 3 questions to put to the panel, as I say. Can you please keep your answers succinct? Because I'm sure the audience will agree that I used to go to a succession of fringe meetings and we never got to the audience part, so we're going to get to the audience part.
Things that you like to hear is often someone you know, but they're not very plugged in. On this issue, they will let you sit down with very senior engineering heads, with very serious people in the company. They mean this, and they mean it for various reasons. Some of it is legal liability. They've built it this way because it's secure, it's safe. It doesn't mean there's big databases that can be hacked. It works. But there's also, if they break it for us, they have to break it for everyone. And that means for countries with secret police that round up gay people, or dissidents, or women who leave the house unaccompanied. And so they hold the line on this. And we've ended up with some very counterproductive sort of policies. It's obvious if WhatsApp shuts down in the UK, you don't have WhatsApp. And if you don't have Signal, that means that you're messaging using less secure stuff. Maybe for most people, they won't notice that until they get hacked, or until big tech's using their private messages to target them. You know, if you start getting targeted ads based on messages about bereavement or family sickness or whatever, that would be why. But Apple have an extra end-to-end encrypted version of their iPhone backup. And the UK government tried to ask them not to encrypt that. Again, sometimes you need to get in criminals' phones. I don't think the reasons for asking for this were bad. But we tried to enforce it globally, and Apple said no, and eventually the government backed down. And so everywhere else in the world, people can access this top-tier privacy and security for their data. And in the UK, you can't. So as a result of our policy, the UK is more vulnerable to having its backup hacked, whether you're a business, whether you're a journalist, whatever. And so our policy reach is within our borders. And so the risk is that we just actually put ourselves behind for competitiveness, for privacy and for safety. And so this is delicate stuff.
Thank you, James.
I mean, if I may, just to add, I think it would be pretty catastrophic for the government's ambition to become preeminent over the US and China in the context of its data AI agenda. And I think it would also undermine confidence in attempts by government itself to modernise and public sector reform, because people will think, well, if you look at withdrawal encryption in these types of apps, what does that mean in terms of modernisation of public sector?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In terms of, if you look at countries like China and you look at Hong Kong, the international business that Hong Kong used to attract has been completely chilled by what's happened within Hong Kong in terms of tax privacy and freedom of expression. That's not necessarily encryption specifically, but I think it's not a silly thing to say that businesses, and I'm sure Vinous can also speak about this, businesses get chilled by places that are not as private. But I just want to, because I think Vinous is probably going to say more on this, but before we move on from me, I also want to say that there are legal implications too. So when there have been some cases brought against countries when they, let me just get the exact name, it's Hodgesol versus Russia, we've been flagged. That was a lawsuit from a year ago, and essentially it basically says that privacy is protected in the European Convention of Human Rights under Article 8, and so if we were to break encryption, we would be in violation of that right, and essentially the government could just be buried in lawsuits because of this. So it's, for what gain? And I'm sure we can go on to that too, is that I think everyone on this panel and probably in this room agrees that the intention of things like the Online Safety Act that flag encryption as a risk factor are very noble, that we all don't want an internet that's just full of horrendous things, but it's just that the way to go about it, this isn't going to actually make the internet any safer. So you've got so many downsides and very little upside.
Yeah, so coming back to that point just very quickly on competitiveness, I think, if you have companies like WhatsApp, Signal leaving the UK, the question is what message does that send? So, for example, would a Revolut be built here in the UK if encryption wasn't sort of guaranteed? And that doesn't just matter for what Revolut brings the UK in terms of sort of tax revenue and talent, etc. It also matters for this idea that there is this flywheel. So dozens of early employees of Revolut have left and started their own startups and businesses, etc. If that flywheel is curtailed, then that ecosystem that the UK has fostered so carefully, ever since the days we talked about, sort of like Silicon Roundabout in 2010, collapses. And so I think, we shouldn't just be very narrow in our view about, okay, well, what does it mean if market leaders of today leave the UK? It's what's that long tail of consequences and unintended consequences that is bred because of it.
We're going to move on to the next question. They're all related, so there'll be opportunities if you've reflected and want to add. But the second related question is, why is secure encrypted messaging so important right now? What would be the impact on our democracy, society, and on business if we no longer had access to that encryption? Quickfire. Let's start at the other end first.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me start with business, because I'm sure others will talk of the sort of more noble purposes like society and democracy. But on the business end, particularly for startups, we are often remote or hybrid first. And so encryption really matters to business at that sort of fundamental layer, because, as Jemimah was saying, it's how employees talk to one another. And in the early stages of sort of the startup life cycle, where you maybe are still figuring out things like product market fit and who is your customer and where are you raising your capital from. Those conversations are incredibly sensitive, and you might not be talking to someone who is in the same room, let alone the same country as you. So encrypted messaging is incredibly important from that perspective, but also the very companies that are trying to be built often rely on where the UK has historical strengths. So areas, as I say, like finance, insurance, legal, biotech, life sciences. And again, these are all areas of sort of huge data sensitivity. So if we want to see a flourishing of those new ecosystems, then encryption is obviously key to that.
I think it would be quite catastrophic, and it would be something that you would necessarily notice instantly. Not like, say, when age gating came in a couple of months ago, where people overnight suddenly were expected to upload lots of details. But I've had I've been frauded for my own banking, and that would have been encrypted, etc. So even with encryption, there are still data leaks, there are still hacks, and essentially you would just be massively opening yourself up. That's setting aside the fact that in the same way that you wouldn't have expected your phones to have all been listened to, then why do you, by the government, then why do you want your online messages to all be read? But I just think that you'll get to a stage in a year or two's time where we already know that you lose a lot of money to hacks and leaks, and it will just exponentially increase, and then what?
What's democracy?
Yeah, I'm slightly challenged with the democracy point in the context of experience locally and in the UK in participatory democracy. The use of WhatsApp, Signal in mobilising people around politics and galvanising them to vote, participate, is a really useful tool. It's cheap, it's accessible, we can target different types of audiences, go deeper, and actually empower people to be part of movements. But I can also see, and have seen, the darker side of how end-to-end encryption platforms such as WhatsApp and Signal have been used to undermine democracy locally. And I'm sure that's the case in international context as well, not least the points that you both made around dissident movements of people that are from marginalised groups that are being targeted by states. So I'm really challenged, and I think that's something that we're going to need to work through.
I'd just like to be a little bit alarmist. I look at America and I look at what Donald Trump is doing in terms of rounding up quote-unquote illegal immigrants, in terms of sending ICE in, overruling local and state governments, in terms of what they're doing to prosecute political opponents, to try and criminalise journalism, to throw out half the Constitution. They set formal safeguards and political safeguards that we do. They have a written constitution, they have a strong Supreme Court to enforce that written constitution, and Trump doesn't have an inbuilt majority in Congress. Parliament is sovereign here. If Nigel Farage became PM with a majority government, he is within his rights to throw out the ECHR, to throw out the Human Rights Act, and to throw out any political safeguards that he doesn't want. He has embraced a policy of mass deportation that he rejected as recently as 6 months ago. They have said, Zia Youssef has said that courts won't be able to prevent deportations, they will do it. If Farage decided as Prime Minister that he needed to be able to read through everyone's messages to see if they were harbouring foreigners who might have been legal until their status has been changed, political safeguards won't stop it. Technological safeguards might. And so security by design, things like end-to-end encryption, might be absolutely vital in our quite near future. And this is the kind of stuff that sounded ridiculous 5 or 10 years ago. I wish it still sounded ridiculous. There are very good commercial and normal business reasons for doing this, but right now we cannot let an accountable, normal, reasonable government like this one normalise steps that would help populist, dangerous, radical government.
Yeah, I would love to go in and kind of add to that, just to kind of consider an example or a scenario. So we've seen in the last 2 weeks that since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and people in America who have gone online publicly and have criticised Charlie Kirk or said stuff that basically put a positive spin on his death. Some of them have lost their jobs. And I would imagine that there's a huge amount of much more chatter of that ilk that's happened via encrypted apps. Now, if that was broken, which is not at this stage, but if that was broken, there have essentially been kind of campaigns to target the people who've been making this speech. That would mean that that private speech would become available information. Now, 5 years ago, you could say, okay, well, in any given minute, you've got just millions of conversations happening. How are you going to mine that data? But with AI, you can now mine that data very, very, very quickly. So you could essentially have a situation where you have someone an autocrat in power. We do not necessarily have the safeguards here. We shouldn't be arrogant. And they could say, okay, well, I just want to, I want to arrest anyone. I mean, you could use it to say, I want to see who in their private conversations has said they disagree with the prescription of Palestine action, for example, and you will get that information very, very, very quickly.
Thank you all. I'm going to move to the final question that I have, and we have 2 minutes. Journalists and parliamentarians and others' private messages. What impact would breaking encryption have on the UK's standing in the world, on diplomacy, on growth, and on competitiveness in 2 minutes? I know we touched on it, but we'd like to go first.
I think this is our side, shall we?
So I'll come back to something that I said perhaps in my opening remarks, which is the UK has been a bit of a sort of safe harbour in terms of like a rules-based order where everyone broadly knows where they stand. If that is diminished, then it only empowers, firstly, those regimes who are, who at the moment are just about sort of towing the line. But it also means that the UK is more loses its competitive edge for the various sort of founders that I work with.
Every time the UK does something that is considered undemocratic, China, Russia, Iran, all those places absolutely delighted. If we were to break encryption, as said, WhatsApp and Signal will probably leave, but in the hypothetical scenario where they don't leave and it gets broken, obviously China and Russia and the bad actors there can access this information, but even if Signal and WhatsApp left, it would be seen as license for China and Russia to lean in even further into human rights attacks.
Thank you.
And we just lose our moral standing, essentially. That's what happens every time these things happen. So when we sit at a table and we say, no, you shouldn't be doing that, they just go, we did this. So.
Thank you. Brilliant. Absolutely bang on time. We have 10 minutes now for questions from the floor. So please, who would like to go first? Could you say your sort of name, rank and number as well? Anybody? Sir.
I'm John Coleman. I'm the COP delegate from Farnborough Newville, and I'm also the head of data engineering for Bank of London. I guess my question really comes up of the intention of breaking encryption, as you previously mentioned. What about the concerns of breaking the business tools? For example, I scoop data from 20 or 30 separate companies. I grab that data from them using secure encryption end-to-end. I turn that data, I bring it into the bank. That travels across the internet, secure. If we break encryption, what would that do to the UK's fundamental business ecosystem when we actually can't business-to-business communicate?
Essentially the pipework being secure and those packets being secure when they're moving in transit, etc. And so I think we shouldn't underplay the business implications of breaking encryption wherever it happens, because this idea that Jemimah, you touched on, that you could break it in one part and have zero impact elsewhere is for the birds. And so I think any weakening of end-to-end encryption has that sort of like downstream impact. whether it is actual or perceived. And I think that's sort of like something that we have to bear in mind.
The scene is a very good and reliable place to do business. You can trust the transaction ledger, you can trust the audit history. I mean, yes. Yes, there is. I think generally my view, Jemimah will know a lot more than me, is Labour's getting a very hard rap on free speech. So far they've just enforced laws that the last government passed, and a lot of people who were in the cabinet when they passed them seem to have forgotten they exist. A lot of the arrests over social media are because social media isn't moderated and it's been outsourced to the police where it shouldn't be. You know, if you made Elon follow his legal obligations, messages would get deleted, that wouldn't be there. And so generally, I think Labour are not being a monster on civil liberties or on privacy, but I think they might want to assess some of their instincts on things like encryption and privacy with an eye to who might follow them if the government doesn't succeed politically and keep them out. So I don't think they're being awful on it, but I wish they had a clearer eye on who might come next, and quite quickly in Scotland and Wales, in councils, etc.
I would add two things. Firstly, just that history is littered with examples of legislation that gets passed by one government with a good intention, and then another government comes in and uses it in a bad way. And the other thing that I would say is Reform have not made sounds about ending encryption, and in fact, the weird thing is that Donald Trump, 4chan, other people in places like that actually also are for encryption now. But that doesn't mean tomorrow. And if again you look at history and you look around the world, the general authoritarian playbook is to start in this place, but you always end with snooping on people. So I don't believe for a second that in 2-3 years' time that Donald Trump won't necessarily be coming after encryption if it's not seen as so desperate for business potentially, or if he decides that he doesn't care about business. I think it's probably the business argument that's actually holding him to it at this stage.
If I may, the thing that just strikes me about this panel debate and really great questions being asked is the policy incoherence given the importance of end-to-end encryption for so many different aspects of life, and we've got such limited time given the scale of catastrophe, both in terms of economic, political, and then the risk and the jeopardy that this presents, that we've got to really stop with the sleepwalking and elevate and amplify voices and mobilise people around this and get some common sense.
I think, I'm afraid I think I just have time to allow the panel to have one final word of something they wish they'd said but haven't before we need to wrap up.
I wish I'd thought of a final word. I'll leave it to the others.
I've said what I wanted to say. I just really the urgency of resolving this pretty quickly.
My final word is a point that Index did kind of start a few years ago essentially, and I think James has also said it, of inviting people outside Parliament, asking them, saying, if you don't care about encryption, hand over your phone, let me have a little look at it, and basically no one will give their phone. And the typical argument for breaking encryption is, what, you've not got anything to hide, what's the worry? And actually, I would just love everyone in this room to have a little think about what they've got on their phone, because I don't have anything illegal on my phone, but without being too much kind of giving away too much, I definitely took some photos of myself, some Jemimah photos when I was pregnant, that are somewhere on my phone, and I don't want anyone to get hold of them. So please think about what's on your phone and how it could be used. And you all work in public-facing industries. You have things on your phone.
I won't say anything that takes away from that.
That's a pretty good last word. Thank you so much. Audience, first of all, and panellists. I mean, what a thoughtful session this has been, and I certainly feel much better informed for my work as a parliamentarian, and significantly more alarmed. than when I started the meeting. So thank you all once again.